C.H. Spurgeon's autobiography, Chapter 42, In Labors More Abundant, continued. Our first sojourn at Exeter Hall, from February the 11th to May 27th, 1855, like the latter assemblies in that historic building, was one long series of special services which gave the church at New Park Street a position it had not previously obtained. The simple record in our church book scarcely conveys an adequate idea of the importance of the forward movement that was about to be inaugurated. Our pastor announced from the pulpit that our place of worship would be enclosed for enlargement for the 8 following Lord's Days, during which period the church and congregation would worship in the large room at Exeter Hall, Strand, on Lord's Day, morning and evening, and that accommodation had also been provided for the usual week evening services to be held at Mays Pond Chapel. The following paragraph, published in the Globe, March 22nd, was extensively copied into other papers, and the comments upon it, both favorable and otherwise, helped still further to attract public attention to our services. The circumstances under which the Reverend C.H. Spurgeon has recently come before the public are curious and demand a passing notice. Some months since, he became minister of New Park Street Chapel, and it was soon found that the building, capacious as it was far too small to accommodate the crowds of persons who flocked to hear the young and eloquent divine. In this state of affairs, there was no alternative but to enlarge the chapel, and while this process was going on, Exeter Hall was engaged for him. For some weeks past, he has been preaching there every Sunday morning and evening, but he has filled the great hall just as easily as he filled New Park Street Chapel. A traveler along the Strand about 6 o'clock on a Sunday evening would wonder what could be the meaning of a crowd which literally stopped the progress of public vehicles and sent unhappy pedestrians round the by-streets in utter hopelessness of getting along the wider thoroughfare. Since the days of Wesley and Whitfield, whose honored names seem to be in danger of being thrown into the shade by this new candidate for public honors, so thoroughly a religious fury has never existed. Mr. Spurgeon is likely to become a great preacher. At present, his fervid and impassionate eloquency sometimes leads him a little astray, and sometimes there is a want of solemnity which mars the beauty of his singularly happy style. Before we had completed the 2 months for which we had engaged Exeter Hall, we found that it was advisable to continue there for 8 more Sabbaths, making 16 in all. Our return to our own chapel is thus recorded in the church book. The meeting house in New Park Street was reopened after the enlargement on Thursday, May 31st, 1855, when 2 sermons were preached, that in the forenoon by Reverend James Sherman of Blackheath, and that in the evening by our pastor. It was a very wet day, and although I am not a believer in omens, I told the people that I regarded it as a prognostication of the showers of blessing we hoped to receive in the enlarged building, and that as it had rained literally at the reopening services, I prayed that we might have the rain spiritually as long as we worshiped there. To the glory of God, I am grateful to testify that it was so. I also quoted to the crowded congregation Malachi 3:10, "Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it," and reminded the friends that if they wished to have the promised blessing, they must comply with the condition attached to it. This they were quite ready to do, and from the time of our return to our much-loved sanctuary until the day when we finally left it, we never had room enough to receive the blessings which the Lord so capriciously poured out for us. There were 2 evenings, June 21st and September 4th, 1855, when I preached in the open air in a field in King Edward's Road, Hackney. On the first occasion, I had the largest congregation I had ever addressed up to that time. But at the next service, the crowd was still greater. By careful calculation, it was estimated that, From 12 to 14,000 persons were present. I think I shall never forget the impression I received when, before we separated, that vast multitude joined in singing, "Praise God, from whom all blessings flow." That night I could understand better than ever before why the Apostle John in the Revelation compared the new song in heaven to the voice of many waters. In that glorious hallelujah, the mighty waves of praise seemed to roll up towards the sky in majestic grandeur, even as the billows of old ocean break upon the beach. Among the notable gatherings in various providential towns, my visits to Trowbridge has a special interest because of the singularity of an extra service that was crowded into my program. I had promised to preach in one place of worship in the afternoon and evening on Monday, April 7, 1856, and in another chapel the following morning. At both the services on the Monday, the building was densely packed, and hundreds had to go away, unable to gain admission. So I offered to preach again at 10 o'clock at night, if the friends could make it known, and bring in a fresh congregation. Many remained after the first evening service, and before the appointed hour, others came in such numbers that the place was again crowded. That was a memorable night, but it was quite eclipsed by another, which I spent in a meeting house not far from the place, which was the scene of a terrible explosion in the Risca, it's R-I-S-C-A, colony in December 1860. That charming spot in the South Wales had frequently yielded me a quiet and delightful retreat. Beautiful for its situation, surrounded by lofty mountains, pierced by romantic valleys, the breathing of its air refreshes the body, and the sight of the eyes makes glad the heart. I had climbed its hills. I had seen the ever-widening landscapes, the mountains of Wales, the plains of England, and the sea sparkling afar. I had mingled with its godly men and women and worshipped God in their assemblies. I have been fired with the gracious enthusiasm of the people when they have listened to the Word. But that night I shall never forget in time or in eternity, when crowded together in the place of worship, hearty Welsh miners who responded to every word I uttered with their Gogentians, encouraged me to preach the gospel and crying, "Glory to God," while the message was proclaimed. They kept me well nigh to midnight, preaching 3 sermons, one after another, almost without a break, for they loved to listen to the gospel. God was present with us, and many a time has the baptism pool been stirred since then by the fruit of that night's labors. Nor shall I ever forget when, standing in the open air beneath God's blue sky, I addressed a mighty gathering within a short distance of that same place, when the Spirit of God was poured upon us, and men and women were strayed to and fro under the heaven's message. As the corn is moved in waves by the summer winds, great was our joy that day when the people met together in thousands, and with songs and praises separated to their homes, talking of what they had heard. I must mention the visit I paid to Stamboni on May 27, 1856, when I preached, at my dear grandfather's request, in commemoration of his ministerial jubilee. He had then been pastor of the Congregational Church at Stamboni for 46 years, and he had previously been minister at Clare in Suffolk for 4 years. I suppose such a service is almost unique. Certainly, I have no recollection of any other incident in which a grandson has had the privilege of preaching for his grandfather under similar circumstances, and I bless God that this was my happy lot. On the previous Sabbath morning at Newport Street Chapel, I delivered substantially the same discourse from Isaiah chapter 46, verse 4, and it was published under the title, "The God of the Aged." Some 1,500 or 2,000 persons assembled at Stamboni for the celebration, and to accommodate them, a large covered space was extemporized by the use of a barn and tents and tarpaulins. The proceedings were naturally full of interest. My venerable friend, Reverend Benjamin Beddow, who assisted me in the compilation of Memories of Stamboni, has recorded the following incident, which otherwise I might have forgotten. In the afternoon, Mr. C.H. Spurgeon made some allusion to Thomas Binney's, B-I-N-N-E-Y', volume, how to make the best of both worlds, and expressed his opinion that no man could serve two masters or live for more than one world. The ardent spirit of the Congregationalist minister was aroused, and he interrupted the speaker. This was a mistake, but though it raised discussion, it produced no result upon the evening congregation, which was as strong and enthusiastic as that which preceded it. We only refer to it for the sake of a squelch to the antidote. Years after, the gentleman who interrupted had such an opinion of C.H. Spurgeon that in a very kind and genteel letter he reminded him of the incident, and asking for a sermon from him, pressed a request by quoting the old saying about Cranmer: "If you do my Lord of Cambury an ill return, he will be your friend all the days of your life." At that time, it was not in the power of C.H. Spurgeon to grant the request, for the season had long been promised to others. But he felt that he would right gladly have done so, had it been within the region of the possible. Great were the crowds of that day. Very busy were all the ladies of the region in making tea, and very liberal were the gifts. The venerable old man, whose ministerial jubilee was thus celebrated, seemed to feel rather the weight of the years than any special exhilaration because of their having reached to 50. Within himself he held a quiet jubilee of rest, which the world could neither give nor take away. My experiences in those early years were very varied, and some of them were so singular that I cannot easily forget them. At one place I was preaching to a great crowd of people, and during the sermon many of the congregation were visibly affected. I felt that the power of the Lord was working there very manifestly. One poor creature absolutely shrieked out because of the wrath of God against sin. On another occasion I had scarcely finished my discourse when a Christian woman who had been listening to it dropped dead in her pew. That was a village in Kent. Not very long afterwards, I went to Trolleysbury in Exeter to preach on a weekday afternoon on behalf of the Sunday school at my father's chapel. There was a large assembly of friends from the surrounding district, and at the close of the service, tea was provided for them in a tent. Before they had finished, the wife of one of the deacons was seized with a fit and died a few minutes. I had not arranged to preach in the evening, but under the circumstances I did so, taking for my text Paul's words, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." An old countryman once came to me after the service and said, "Ah, young man, you have had too deep a text. You handled it well enough, but that is an old man's text, and I felt afraid to hear you announce it." I replied, "Is God's truth dependent on age? If the thing is true, it is just as well to hear it from me as from anyone else. But if you can hear it better anywhere else, you have the opportunity." I recollect one hearer that I had of quite a different sort, preaching about in the country. I had often noticed in a certain county a man in a smock frock who was a regular follower. He seemed to be amazingly attentive to the service. In thinking that he looked an extremely poor man, I one day gave him 5 shillings. When I preached 20 miles off, there he was again, and I gave him some more help, fancying that he was a child of God. When I was preaching in another place in the same county, there he was again, and the thought suddenly occurred to me, that man finds something more attractive in the palms of my hand than in the words of my lips, so I gave him no more. The next time I saw him, he put himself in my way, but I avoided him, and then at last, being again in the same county, he came up and asked me to give him something. "No," I said, "you will have no more from me. I see why you have come. You have followed me pretending to delight in the word, and to be profited by it, whereas it is profit you can get out of me, not profit from the gospel." In another part of the country, I was preaching once to people who kept continually looking round, and I adopted the expedient of saying, "Now, friends, it is so very interesting to you to know who comes in, and it disturbs me so very much for you to look round. I will, if you like, describe each one as he comes in, so that you may sit and look at me and keep up at least a show of decency." I described one gentleman who came in, who happened to be a friend whom I could dispute without offense, as a very respectable gentleman who had just taken his hat off, and so on. And after that one attempt, I found it was not necessary to describe any more, because they felt shocked at what I was doing, and I assured them that I was much more shocked than they should render it necessary for me to reduce their conduct to such an absurdity. It cured them for the time being, and I hope forever, much to the pastor's joy. On one of my many early journeys by the Eastern County Railway, as the GER was then called, I had a singular adventure upon which I have often looked back with pleasurable recollections. I had been in the country to preach and was returning to London. All at once I discovered that my ticket was gone, and a gentleman, the only other occupant of the compartment, noticing that I was fumbling about in my pockets as though in search of something I could not find, said to me, "I hope you have not lost anything, sir." I thanked him and told him that it was my ticket that was missing, and that by a remarkable coincidence I had neither watch nor money with me. I seldom wear a watch, and probably the brother whom I had gone to help had seen to me in need of any coin that I might have had in my possession before I started on my homeward journey. But I added, "I am not at all troubled, for I have been on my master's business, and I am quite sure all will be well. I have had so many interpositions of divine providence in small matters as well as great ones, that I feel as if, whatever happens to me, I am bound to fall on my feet, like the man on the Mannix penny." The gentleman seemed interested and said that no doubt it would be all right, and we had a very pleasant and, I hope, profitable conversation until the train had nearly reached Bishopsgate Station and the collectors came for the tickets. As the official opened the door of my compartment, he touched his hat to my traveling companion, who simply said, "All right, William," whereupon the man again saluted and retired. After he had gone, I said to the gentleman, "It is very strange that the collector did not ask for my ticket." "No, Mr. Spurgeon," he replied, calling me by my name for the first time. "It is only another illustration of what you told me about the providence of God watching over you even in small things. I am the general manager of this line, and it was no doubt divinely arranged that I should happen to be your companion just when I could be of service to you. I knew you were all right, and it has been a great pleasure to meet you under such happy circumstances." A somewhat similar incident of the presence of a friend in need occurred at a later period in my life, but it follows so appropriately upon the previous one that it may as well be related here. I was going to preach somewhere in the north of London, and to reach my destination I had to pass through the city. When I was in Prince's Street, near the bank, my horse fell. Some of the harness gave way, and one of the shafts of the carriage was broken. Almost at that instant that the accident happened, a hand was thrust in at the window, and the owner of it gave me his card and said, "I know where you are going, Mr. Spurgeon. You have no time to lose in getting to the chapel. Take a cab and go on about your master's business. I'll stay with the coachman and see what can be done with the horse and carriage." I did as the gentleman suggested, and after I had preached, was ready to return. There was the carriage at the chapel door ready for me, and the coachman gave me the message that there was nothing to pay. I wrote to thank the generous friend for his timely and welcome help and gift, and in his reply he said, "I only hope that next time your horse goes down, I may be close at hand, or that somebody else may be there who will feel it as great a pleasure to be of service to you as I have done. You do not know me, but I am well acquainted with one of your deacons, and through him I have heard a good deal about you. So he took care of me for my deacon's sake, and still more for my Lord's sake. And many a time have I had kindnesses shown to me by those who, until then, had been complete strangers to me. Other people may not think much of such instances, but to me they are intensely interesting, and they fill me with adoring gratitude to God." The following letter is written by Mr. Spurgeon to his very intimate friend, Mr. J.S. Watts, Regent Street, Cambridge, to whom a reference was made in Volume 1, Chapter 22 of the autobiography. have been most kindly placed at Mrs. Spurgeon's disposal by Miss Watts. They record the young pastor's experiences during the period now under review and throw a vivid light on many of the notable instances which occurred in 1854 through 1856. 75 Dover Road, August 25, 1854. My very dear friend, I am astonished to find that fame has become so invenerated a fabricator of untruths. For I assure you that I had no more idea of coming to Cambridge on Wednesday than of being dead last week. I have been this week in T-Ring and Hertfordshire on the borders of Bucks. I have climbed the goodly hills and seen the fair vale of Aylesbury below. In the morning I startled the hare from her form, and at eve talked with the countless stars. I love the glades and dells, the hills and vales, and I had had my fill of them. The week before I was preaching at Ramsgate, and then tarried a while at Marsgate, and came home by boat. Kent is indeed made to rejoice in her God, for in the parts I traversed the harvest was luxurious, and all seemed thankful. The Crystal Palace is likewise a favorite haunt of mine. I shall rejoice to take your arm one day and survey its beauty with you. Now for the cause at New Park Street. We are getting on too fast. Our harvest is too rich for the barn. We have had one meeting to consider an enlargement, quite unanimous. Met again on Wednesday, and then a committee will be chosen immediately to provide larger accommodations. On Thursday evening, people can scarcely find a vacant seat. I should think not a dozen in the whole chapel. On Sabbath days, the crowd is immense, and the seat holders cannot get into their seats. Half an hour before time, the aisles are a solid block, and many stand through the whole service, wedged in by their fellows and prevented from escaping by the crowd outside, who seal up the doors and fill the yard in front, and stand in throngs as far as the sound can reach. I refer mainly to the evening, although the morning is nearly the same. Souls are being saved. I have more inquirers than I can attend to. From 6 to 7 o'clock on Monday and Thursday evening, I spend in my vestry. I give but brief interviews then, and have to send many away without being able to see them. The Lord is wondrous in praises. A friend has in a letter expressed his hope that my initials may be prophetic. C, comfort. H, happiness. S, satisfaction. I can truly say they are, for I have comfort in my soul, happiness in my work, and satisfaction with my glorious Lord. I am deeply in debt for your offer of hospitality. Many thanks to you. My kindest regards to all my friends and yours, especially your sons and daughters. I am sure it gives me delight to be remembered by them, and I hope it will not be long before I run down to see them. Hoping you will be blessed in going out and coming in. I am yours truly, C.H. Spurgeon. 75 Dover Street, Saturday, October or November, 1854. My dear friend, I do not think I can by any means manage to see you. There is just a bare possibility that I may be down by the 1:30 train on Monday morning, but do not prepare for me or expect me. I can only write very briefly today, as it is Saturday. Congregations as crowded as ever. 25 added to the church last month. 12 proposed this month. Enlargement of chapel to be commenced speedily. £1,000 required. Only one meeting held last Friday evening. £700 or £800 already raised. We shall have more than enough. I gave £100 myself to start the people off. Friends firm, enemies alarmed, devil angry, sinners saved, Christ exalted, self not well. Enlargement to comprise 300 seats to let and 300 free sittings, 200 more to be decided on. I have received anonymously in 1 month for distribution £18 5 shillings, and have given it to poor Christians and sick persons. Love to you all. Excuse haste. Forgot to say, prayer meeting, 500 in regular attendance. Glory to the Master. Yours in Jesus, C.H. Spurgeon. 75 Dover Road, March 23rd, 1855. My dear friend and brother, often have I looked for a note from you, but I have not reproached you, for I too have been negligent. Really, I never seem to have an hour to call my own. I am always at it, and the people are teasing me, almost to death, to get me to let them hear my voice. It is strange that such a power should be in one small body to crowd Exeter Hall to suffocation and block up this Strand, so that pedestrians have to turn down byways and all other traffic is at a standstill. The Globe last evening says that never since the days of Whitfield was there such a religious figure, and that the glories of Wesley and Whitfield seem in danger of being thrown into the shade. Well, the press has kicked me quite long enough. Now they are beginning to lick me. But one is as good as the other so long as it helps to fill our place of worship. I believe I could secure a crowded audience at dead of night in a deep snow. On Fast Day, all Fulton Square was full. Police active, women shrieking, and at the sight of me the rush was fearful. Strange to say, 9/10 of my hearers are men. But one reason is that women cannot endure the awful pressure, the renting of clothes, etc., etc. I have heard of parties coming to the hall from 10 to 20 miles distance, being there half an hour before time, and then never getting so much as near the door. Dear me, how little satisfies the crowd. What on earth are other preachers up to, when with 10 times the talent they are snoring away with posy sermons and sending the world away? The reason is, I believe, they do not know what the gospel is. They are afraid of real gospel Calvinism, and therefore the Lord does not own them. And now for spiritual matters. I have had knocking about enough to kill a dozen, but the Lord has helped me. Somewhere in Nibidus, N-U-B-I-B-U-S, there lays a vast mass of N-E-B-U-L-A, made of advice given to me by friends, most of it about humility. Now, my master is the only one who can humble me. My pride is so infernal that there is not a man on earth who can hold it in all their silly attempts of fertile. But then my master can do it, and he will. Sometimes I get such a view of my own insignificance that I call myself all the fools in the world for even letting pride pass my door without frowning at him. I am now, as ever, able to join with Paul in saying, having nothing and yet possessing all things. Souls are being converted and flying like doves to the windows. The saints are more zealous and more earnest in prayer. Many of the man-made parsons are mad and revile me. But many others are putting the steam on, for this is not the time to sleep in. The Lord is abroad, the enemy trembles. Mark how the devil roars. See Etta, E-R-A. Last week, a theoretical paper where you can read about Exeter Hall Theatre linked with Drury Lane, Princess, etc. Read the slander in IPS, WICH Express, and the London Empire. The two later have made an apology. What a fool the devil is. If he had not vilified me, I should not have had so many precious souls as my hearers. I long to come and throw one of my bombs into Cambridge. You are a sleepy set and want an explosion to wake you. He will admit a gentleman whose initials are JSW. I am coming on Good Friday. Is your house still the bishop's hostel? Of course it is. Now do write me. I love you as much as ever and owe you a vast debt. Why not come and see me? I know you pray for me. With Christian love to you and kind remembrances to all your family, I am yours forever, C.H. Spurgeon. 75 Dover Road, Tuesday, April 1855. Dear friend and brother, D.V., Thursday. I shall be with you at 1:30 by the mail train. I shall be glad to preach in St. Andrew's Street Chapel, but shall disappoint you all. The people are silly to follow me so much. It now gets worse. Crowds awful on Sunday last. Collected £90 morning and evening at the hall. At Shoreditch on Tuesday, there were 800 or 900, where only 600 should have been admitted. Upon personally appealing to the throng outside, disappointed at not getting in, most of them dispersed, and allowed the rest of us to worship as well as we could, with the windows open to let those here who remained outside. Joseph is still shot at by the archers and sorely grieved. See Baptist Reporter, United Presbyterian Magazine, Critic, Christian News, etc., with a lot of small fry. But his bow abides in strength, neither does he tremble. Oh, my dear brother, envy has vexed me sorely. Scarcely a Baptist minister of standing will own me. I am sick of man, but when I find a good one, I love him all the better because of the contrast to others. I have just received a handsome silver inkstand bearing this inscription, presented to Mr. C.H. Spurgeon by J. and S. Aldis, as a token of sincere gratitude to him, as the instrument, under Almighty God, of turning them from darkness to light. March 30th, 1855. The devil may look at that as often as he pleases. It will afford him sorrow comfort. And now, farewell. Christian love to you and yours from yours deeply in debt, C.H. Spurgeon. New Kent Road, Southwark, February 23rd, 1856. My dear brother, a wearied soldier finds one moment of leisure to write a dispatch to his brother in arms. 11 times this week I have gone forth to battle, and at least 13 services are announced for next week. Additions to the church last year, 282. Received this year in 3 months more than 80. 30 more proposed for next month. Hundreds who are equally sincere are asking for admission, but time will not allow us to take in more. Congregation more than immense. Even the Times has noticed it. Everywhere at all hours, places are cramped to the doors. The devil is wide awake, but so too is the master. The Lord Mayor, though a Jew, has been to our chapel. He came up to my vestry to thank me. I am to go and see him at the Manson house. The Chief Commissioner of Police also came and paid me a visit in the vestry. But, better still, some thieves, thimble riggers, harlots, etc. have come, and some are now in the church, as also a right honorable hot potato man who is prominently known as a hot Spurgeonite. The sale of sermons is going up. Some have sold 15,000. Wife, first rate, beloved by all my people. We have good reason mutually to rejoice. I write mere heads, for you can fill up details. I have been this week to Leighton, Buzzard, Foots, Cray, and Chatham. Everywhere no room for the crowd. Next week I am to be thus occupied. Sabbath, morning and evening, New Park Street. Afternoon to address the schools. Monday, morning at Howard Hinton's Chapel. Afternoon, New Park Street. Evening, New Park Street. Tuesday, afternoon and evening, Leighton. Wednesday, morning and evening, Zion Chapel, Whitechapel. Thursday, morning, Dalston. Evening, New Park Street. Friday morning, Dr. Fletcher's Chapel. Evening, Mr. Rogers' Chapel, Brixton. With best love, yours in haste, C.H. Spurgeon. End of chapter 42. C.H. Spurgeon's autobiography, chapter 43. First visit to Scotland. At one of the services in Glasgow, during the tour described in the following chapter, Mr. Spurgeon referred to some ministers who apologized for not preaching so often or so vigorously as they once did, because they are now 57 years of age, and then added, 57, only 57? What a happiness to preach till one is 57. I wish I could preach till I was 57. How many souls I might be the means of converting by that time. Mr. Spurgeon did preach till he was 57, and only the Lord knows how many souls had been up to that date brought to the Savior through his ministry, nor how great will be the ultimate number saved through his printed sermons and other works. My first visit to Scotland was paid in July 1855, and for many reasons it left lasting impressions on my memory. It began with some discomfort, for I journeyed from London to Glasgow by night, and traveling at that time was accomplished under conditions very different from those of the present day. On my arrival in the morning, I found my esteemed friend, Mr. John Anderson, ready to receive me and to conduct me to his hospitable mansion. This good brother must be confounded
with his namesake, Reverend John Anderson of Helensburgh, whose acquaintance I did not make until several months later, but who, from our first meeting, became my lifelong champion and friend. On the Sabbath, July 15th, I preached in the morning at the Hope Street Baptist Chapel, Dr. Patterson's, and in the evening in West George Street Chapel, where the eminent Dr. Wardlaw had formerly ministered with great acceptance. It was a glorious sight to see the people crowding both places of worship, but it also increased my own sense of responsibility. I believe that we had the presence of God at each of the services and that much good was done. Various newspapers gave reports, characterized by more or less truthfulness and kindly feeling. But in the case of one, the contrast to its contemporaries was all the more marked for the fact that it bore in its title the sacred name of Christian, while others were looked upon as secular papers. The Daily Bulletin, July 16th, contained the following article: Visit to Glasgow of the Reverend Mr. Spurgeon's of London. The visit to Glasgow of this gentleman was announced a few days ago, was looked forward to with great pleasure by those who knew anything of his extraordinary gifts and powers. He preached twice yesterday in the forenoon in Hope Street Baptist Chapel, in the evening in West George Street Church. There was on the first occasion a full audience. On the second, many hundreds had to turn away, while every available inch within the church and without it, as far as the speaker's magnificent voice could reach, was occupied. Mr. Spurgeon owed his celebrity to the possession of first-class oratorical gifts which seemed to have obtained maturity of development at a very early age, so that he was established a reputation at a period of life earlier than that at which ordinary men enter upon a profession. His appearance indicates him somewhat beyond his actual age, and like his great model, Whitfield, he seems blessed with no constitution. That is, he is endowed with a strong voice, clear, bell-like, which could be heard by an audience of very many thousands, and with a physical frame equal to a vast amount of hard work. In the contour of face, he reminds us somewhat of the Reverend John Card, C-A-I-R-D, and his eye has the lustrous light of genius in it. You cannot listen for a few minutes to the bright-eyed boy, whether he be preaching or pleading in prayer, without feeling that no mere clad-trap rhetorician is before you. There is a force and massiveness about his thoughts and language, a touching, compelling sincerity, which give us the best idea we have ever had of the great early preachers. Like some of these, or like Rowland Hill or Whitfield of latter times, he descends to a homeliness of illustrations, to anecdote each to mimicry, a dangerous style, for great taste must be always exercised along with it. But in the ability to pass from the homely or the grotesque to the dizzy heights of imagination, the real power of the orator is seen. The impression is too vivid to permit of our entering on any critical view of the discourses of yesterday. The subject of the one was the Savior on the tree, and of the other, the Lamb upon the throne. Suffice it to say that, as most brilliant and thrilling pulpits appeals, we have rarely heard them equaled, certainly, in some points of effect, never surpassed. The Glasgow Examiner, which had previously displayed a very friendly feeling, thus reported in its issue on July 21st the first Sabbath services. The Reverend C.H. Spurgeon, it having been for some time generally understood that this distinguished divine, for and against whom so much has been written and said, would visit Glasgow, the curiosity of the church-going people was thoroughly roused. So many and varied were the opinions of his critics that we believe many of the crowd assembled in Hope Street Baptist Chapel last Sunday morning, expecting to see a nondescript who, instead of elevating their thoughts to the throne of the Most High, would merely endeavor to excite laughter. But when the first tones of the speaker's clear, full voice fell upon their ears, invoking, in language most sublime and beautiful, the presence and blessing of God, they must indeed have felt that truth had been said when he was compared to George Whitefield, the Prince of Preachers. After singing, he read a chapter in the New Testament, expounding as he went along, a method which it is to be regretted our ministers do not more often adopt, as it affords such an excellent opportunity of dispelling the difficulties which so often arise in reading the Scriptures. The subject of discourse was from Matthew 27, verse 36. And sitting down, they watched him there. Seldom has a discourse so thrillingly eloquent been delivered in Glasgow. The arrangement was exceedingly neat, the ideas original, while the whole breath of spirit of most genuine piety. One thing in particular we noticed. Mr. Spurgeon follows the example of the great teacher of Christianity in illustrating his meaning from exterior objects, a mode which cannot be too highly recommended. It so much aids the retention of the discourse upon the memory. In the evening, West George Street Chapel was filled in every part, and long before the appointed hour, many were unable to gain admittance. The text was from Revelations chapter 14, verse 1. Many parts of the sermon were distinguished by exceeding pathos and strength of imagination, and the preacher's allusions to the covenant and martyrs of Scotland showed that he had discovered the nearest way to the strong, brave hearts of the Scottish people. One incident proved that he had completely thawed their hearts. On coming out of the chapel, every one to whom it was possible rushed forward to shake hands with him, so that it was with considerable difficulty he entered the carriage which stood in waiting. When Mr. S. again preaches in Glasgow, we hope that it will be to a larger chapel, as doubtless many more will wish to hear him from the report carried away by those who had the privilege yesterday. The Christian News, July 21st, published an article in quite another strain. C.H. Spurgeon, heralded by certain paragraphs for which those who know how to sound a trumpet before them are able, by some occult influences, to find a place is not a few of the newspapers, albeit they are occasionally extinguished by the avid carrier advertisement or snubbed by the dogged and dogging communicated. The Reverend C.H. Spurgeon made his debut in this city on Sunday last. In the morning, he was amused or disgusted a respectable audience in Hope Street Baptist Church, and in the evening he flunked out his platitudes and stale anti-Arminianism to a large audience in West George Street Chapel, where was wont to be heard the silver tones of a classic war law. He did not form part of the morning audience, but from credible reports we have not ceased till now congratulate ourselves that we neither witnessed the buffoonery of that exhibition nor listened to the commonplace denunciation of bigotry, repeated, by the way, in the evening, while Mr. S. consistently hedged round by doctrines of dogmas of the most rampant exclusiveness. The evening's exhibition was, we are informed, a little quieter than the morning one. Perhaps the preacher had heard in the interval that Scotland is not so thoroughly Calvinistic as he in his dreams had fancied, and it may have been hinted to him that the pulpit in which, by some unaccountable oversight, we may not say maneuvering, he was to be permitted to stand, had been consecrated to the intelligent proclamation of doctrines, certainly even in their deficiencies, more heart and mind satisfying than the mere dirt which he has himself become muddled, and by casting forth which he seeks to muddle the minds of others. We must also remind those who play lacquer to Mr. S. that their strength or weakness is apt to be known from the company they keep, so that, striking hands with bigots and buffoons, they may be suspected of a fellowship therewith, notwithstanding any half-hearted disclaimers they may put forth. If you can't alone fight Arminianism, do engage one of the contests who knows what Arminianism is, and do not bring disgrace upon yourself in your creed by endeavoring to screen both behind the mask of the clown. In compassion, too, upon the boy who has fallen into your hands, remember the mischief you may bring upon him, if it be not already brought, and against which Paul guards in 1 Timothy 3:6. There may be occasion to deal a blow to the mask. If so, let the master look to himself. As I have gone to the north partly for a holiday during the week, I sojourned on to the highlands, where I reveled in the great scenery of the country, of which Sir Walter Scott wrote. Meet nurse for a poetic child, land of brown health and shaggy wood, land of the mountain and the flood. There was one place where my friend Anderson was particularly anxious for me to preach. That was Aberfetty, an obscure and curious village. There was an independent chapel there, and usually kirk, but nobody appeared even to have heard the name of Spurgeon, so there was some difficulty in knowing how to draw the people together to hear the word. However, early in the morning Mr. Anderson knocked at my door and said, "I have thought of a plan of getting you a congregation tonight." I answered, "I am not very particular about the plan, so you try it if you think it will succeed." He sent round the crier at 9 and 12 and 3 o'clock with a notice of this effect: "Your old acquaintance, Johnny Anderson, who used to live here in Aberfetty, has arrived and has brought with him his adopted son Timothy, who is going to preach tonight." Then followed an account of my labors and successes in London, and an earnest invitation to all to be present. As the appointed hour drew nigh, the brighter Scots began to assemble, and by the time for beginning the service, the chapel was well filled. The good minister gave out one of the psalms, which was sung in a very devout style, but not with that heartiness to which I had been accustomed among my own warm-hearted friends. I then read and expounded a portion of Scripture, and was much pleased to see nearly every one following me most attentively and very devoutly listening to the simple exposition which it is my custom to offer. After prayer and singing, I began to preach. But there was no eyes of fire and no beaming countenances to cheer me while proclaiming the gospel message. The greater part of the congregation sat in apparent indifferency. They seemed made of lumps of ice fetched from Wenham Lake. I tried all means to move them, but in vain. At one time, a racy remark provoked a smile from two or three, but the rest, deeming it profane to laugh, sat like those two eminent Egyptian gentlemen in the Crystal Palace, looking at me with majestic but affected solemnity. Then I advanced to more pathetic themes, and although I myself wept, not a tear came from the eyes of my audience. But with but one or two exceptions, I felt like the Welshman who could make Welshmen jump, but could not move the English. I thought within myself, surely your blood is very cold here, for everywhere else I should have seen signs of emotion while preaching Christ and Him crucified. Certainly some did appear impressed, but on the whole I never saw so cold an assembly in my life. The sermon over and the concluding prayer offered, a rush was made for the door, and before I could descend the pulpit stairs, the chapel was deserted and the whole flock scattered abroad. Never did I see so hasty an evacuation, and I am certain that if the village was ever threatened by the Russians, the inhabitants would be able to escape over the hills and far away in an hour's notice if they used the same expedition. Feeling rather sad at our singular service, I went into the street and was delighted to find that although cold as marble in the building, they were now hearty and full of feeling. I will not limit the real one of Israel. I trust some secret work was done. The earnest thanks for my trouble and the eager request that I should come again showed that there had been some appreciation of the service, despite that formality which their training had engendered. I retired to rest with the conviction that the last day would prove that the seed was not lost, and I confidently expected to see in glory some soul plucked from the burning by the arm of the Holy Spirit, through the message delivered by me to the people of Aberfetty. On my way back to Glasgow, I had an adventure which was somewhat unpleasant, and which might have had more serious consequences. The accounts of it were considerably exaggerated. My friends in London were told that I had been thrown into the water and dragged by the hair of my head. It was not so, though there certainly was some danger, as my letter, published in the North British Daily Mail, July 20th, plainly shows. Narrow escape at Govan Ferry. To the editor of the North British Daily Mail, Sir, the value of the press as the corrector of abuses is incalculable. Will you allow me to avail myself of your columns to expose an individual who ought to suffer some more severe penalty for his folly? On returning on Wednesday evening from a tour in the Highlands, I requested to be set on shore at Govan Ferry. A boat was brought alongside, into which I entered, and was not a little distressed to find that strong drink had been doing mischief with the brains of the boatsmen. We were propelled, much to the dismay of the ladies on board, upon the track, which a steamer then approaching was certain to take. The boat was, however, after some remonstrance, guided safely to the side of the other steamer, and then the manager of the boat, who was as drunk as a lord, filled it until we stood so thickly together that we could not move, and the slightest motion must have set us all to the bottom. Now, sir, I have not the honor to be a Scotman, but I may ask, are there no authorities who can prevent boats from being overcrowded and call a man to account who was so drunk as to be incapable of anything except the lowest abuse and swearing? Should an important ferry be in the hands of a man who has not sufficient respect for himself to avoid drunkenness and is so careless of the lives of others that he can so foolishly expose them? We were safely landed, but not until one gentleman had been over his knees in the water. But should another time be less propitious, some life must be lost. I have written, not for myself, but for the other 24 who were placed in so perilous a situation. Yours, etc., C.H. Spurgeon. The following letter, written to Mr. Spurgeon to his father at this date, has been preserved. He had it copied and laid aside with other material for his autobiography. Fairfield, near Glasgow, July 19, 1855. My dear Father, during the past week I have been among the noble mountains in the Highlands, and you will rejoice to hear how much better I feel. Last Saturday I preached twice in Glasgow to immense crowds. There is as much stir about me here as there is in London, and I hope souls are really being saved. I am sure you will excuse my being brief, since I have so many letters to answer, and I do not want to keep indoors, but to have all the air I can. Oh, what must God be, if such are his works? I suppose Mother is back. Kiss her for me, and give my love to all. I am happy, but had rather be home again. You will guess the reason. I only want that one person to make the trip a very fine one. But patience, Charles. Best love to you, my very dear father, from your affectionate son, Charles. I had promised to preach at Bradford the following Sabbath, July 22nd, and on my way to Yorkshire, I made a short stay at Lake Windermere, round which I sailed and greatly enjoyed the beauties of its scenery. On reaching Bradford, I found that the Friends had engaged a music hall, which they said held 1,000 persons more than the Exeter Hall. but it was not large enough to contain the crowds that came. On the Sunday morning, almost as many had to go away as were accommodated in the building. In the evening, the streets presented a solid block of living men and women. The place was crammed to excess, and I had scarcely room to move about to deliver what I had to say to the people. At the end of the day, I was delighted to find that not only had thousands of persons heard the word, but they had given £144 towards the Sabbath schools in connection with which the services had been held. From Bradford, I went to Stockton-on-Tees, and there again I preached to a very large congregation. Journeying back again to Scotland, I conducted a service in Queen Street Hall, Edinburgh, on Wednesday evening, July 25th. Notwithstanding pouring rain, a great crowd of people again assembled. I was very delighted, after the sermon, to meet with a military officer who grabbed my hand and said, "For 20 years I have served Your Majesty, yet never had I heard the word of God to my soul's profit until I stepped into Dr. Wardlaw's chapel at Glasgow a week ago last Sabbath. But now I am enlisted in the army of the King of Kings. The Lord God of hosts bless you. The King of Kings be with you. The God of Jacob help you everywhere." I blessed the dear man and retired to rest, conscious that if I had done nothing else yet, through my instrumentality, one of the heroes of the Crimea, who had not turned his back on the day of battle, was found numbered among the good soldiers of Jesus Christ. The Christian News, July 28th, thus described the service. The Reverend C.H. Spurgeon in Edinburgh. According to announcement in the newspapers and by place cards, this reverend gentleman, whose appearances have created such an interest in Exeter Hall, London, preached a sermon in Queen Street Hall, Edinburgh, on Wednesday evening, 25th, followed with a seat which commanded an admirable prospect of the platform. We waited for 3/4 of an hour, in company with a multitude of sightseers who had been drawn together by the fame or notoriety of the preacher, and as the sequel proved, were but rather sparingly rewarded for our pains. Mr. Spurgeon's oratory was unequal and clumsy in the extreme. The Spirit having deserted him, according to his own confession, might not this be a punishment for his non-preparation? For he glories that he never prepares, which in our ears, particularly from a minister, sounds very much like glorying in his shame, though he informed his audience that at times his eloquency is like the mountain torrent and rolls along like a winged chariot. We were sorry for Mr. Spurgeon, more sorry for his friends, and most sorry for the audience, many of whom were competent persons and had evidently come to listen to something extraordinary in the use of the pulpit. That Mr. Spurgeon should have become an idol in London, we do not wonder, for we remember Mr. J. of Bath saying that the London public is the most gullible public on the face of the earth, and that any man who should vociferate standing on his head would gather immense congregations around him, whatever his vulgarity and insolence. Mr. S., in our estimation, is just a spoiled boy, with abilities not more than mediocre, and will, for certain, if he does not retrace his steps, share the fate of the early gooseberry or the monster cucumber that appear almost annually in the columns of the newspapers, sink into obscurity, leaving only the memorial of his career, that he was and that he has descended to that nullity from which, by puffing and blustering, he originally and unworthily sprang. The reference in the above paragraph to desertion by the Spirit of God was a gross perversion of fact, for I had not neglected preparation for the service. The incident was very vividly impressed upon my mind and heart, but I think the true lesson to be learned from it was the one I tried to teach my own people after I returned to London. I said to them, once, while preaching in Scotland, the Spirit of God was pleased to desert me. I could not speak as usually I have done. I was obliged to tell the people that the chariot wheels were taken off, and that the chariot dragged along very heavily. I have felt the benefit of that experience ever since. It humbled me bitterly, and if I could, I would have hidden myself in any obscure corner of the earth. I felt as if I should speak no more in the name of the Lord. And then the thought came, O thou art an ungrateful creature. Hath not God spoken by 300 of times? And this once, when he would not do so, wilt thou upbraid him for it? Nay, rather thank him that he hath so long stood by thee. And if once he hath forsaken thee, admire his goodness, that thus he would keep thee humble. Some may imagine that want of study brought me into that condition, but I can honestly affirm that it was not so. I think that I am bound to give myself unto reading, and not to tempt the Spirit by unthought of infusion. I always deem it a duty to seek my sermons from the Master, and employ him to impress them on my mind. But on that occasion, I think I had prepared even more carefully than I ordinarily do, so that unpreparedness was not the reason for the lack of force I then mourned. The simple fact is this: the wind bloweth where it listeth, and sometimes the winds themselves are still. Therefore, if I rest on the Spirit, I cannot expect that I should always feel his power alike. What could I do without his celestial influence? To that I owe everything. Other servants of the Lord have had experiences similar to mine. In the life of Whitfield, we read that sometimes under one of his sermons, 2,000 persons would profess to be saved, and many of them were really so. At other times, he preached just as powerfully, and no conversions were recorded. Why was that? Simply because in the one case the Holy Spirit went with the Word, in the other case he did not. All the heavenly result of preaching is owing to the divine Spirit sent from above. On the next Sabbath, July 29th, I preached twice more in Glasgow. The morning service was at West Nile Street Chapel, Reverend A. Fraser's, and there again I found the necessity for a much larger building to hold all the people who wanted to be present. In the evening, I preached in Greyfriars Church, Dr. King's, and that spacious house of prayer was crowded to its utmost capacity, while I was afterwards assured by the editor of one of the papers that 20,000 persons went away, unable to obtain admission. Once more I received the help of my gracious Master, as I proclaimed his truth to the eager crowd that came to hear it. John Smith, Esquire, M.A., the editor of the Glasgow Examiner, inserted in his paper an account of these two services with a lengthy critique upon my ministry, commencing thus: the way moth-eaten routine generally settles off anyone who dares to break away from this old, time-worn tracks is by pronouncing him an empirican. Galileo, Columbus, Luther, Knox, the Apostle Paul, and even the author of Christianity himself were, in the accredited orthodoxy of their day, stigmatized as empirical. And so will it be with anyone who ventures to do or say otherwise than according to the existing modes and fashions. Routine in religious services is extremely liable to beget a listless, lukewarm compliancy with its prescribed forms, while the spirit or animus gradually subsides. The preacher speaks his usual time. The people sit patiently enough. Perhaps a few may even listen. The usual number of verses is sung, and the business of the day is over. There is generally no more about it. No one can deny that this is more or less than a simple statement of the real state of matters in the majority of our churches at the present day. Should the minister during his discourse sharpen his intellects with a sprinkling of snuff, let fall his handkerchief on the psalm book, or give one thump louder than usual with the fist ecclesiastical, that would be noted, remembered, and commented on, while there is all but total oblivion of the subject and the nature of the discussion. To break up this deadening process, to shake the dry bones and make them live, ought to be the great aim of the preacher at the present day. But it is not everyone who can do it. Affectionation of manner or style won't do it. Talent, we may say, genius or a peculiar nature is required. And we have no hesitation in saying that Mr. Spurgeon possesses the requisites of an unusual degree. No doubt many respectable and sensible men when hearing of the odd and to them uncanonical expressions of this young preacher, would be very apt to find the word empirical or quack upon their tongue's end. We must ourselves plead guilty to some such expression when we first heard of his youth, unsystematic training, and official boldness. We, in common with our fellow citizens, have seen and heard so much of the boy preaching, lay preaching, and bold preaching, that there was nothing uncharitable in entertaining some doubts of his intrinsic excellence. Still, that large London audiences daily waited on his ministry was a fact that could not be stifled with a sneer. It could not be any novelty in the theme itself, as there were thousands of preachers and millions of books and tracts dilating on it before Mr. Spurgeon made his appearance. It could not be any new doctrine, for this was the same as John Calvin preached centuries ago, and circumstantially the same as that preached by the evangelical denominations around him. Neither could it be his youth, as there are in the churches of Britain scores of preachers as young as he is. Neither could it be the few tour sentences which were scattered throughout his discourses, for there are many in London who say stranger and odder things than any that he has yet uttered. But what was the character of these crowds that went to hear him? Were they the profane, the ignorant and illiterate, the light-hearted and frivolous young people of the metropolis? There might have been some of these among the many, but as far as we can learn, they were fair examples of the respectable church-going community, perfectly capable of judging rationally on all subjects that engross public attention. We maintain that no man could have sustained such excitement and kept together such crowds of people for 2 or 3 years unless he was possessed of more than ordinary gifts. But we do not now require to judge him by the efforts of his preaching upon a metropolitan crowd. He has appeared among us, and the London verdict has been fully confirmed by immense audiences that have been equally spellbound by his oratory. According to reports, he indulged somewhat freely in the out-of-the-way expressions on the first Sabbath of his sojourn in this city, but such was not the case last Sabbath, and his discourses on that occasion were still more fascinating and attractive. In the first place, there is about him that hearty, open English frankness, which has no hesitation in giving full and free utterance into its opinions, loves, and dislikes. And then there is the ready, acute perception, which never fails to bring out fresh and striking illustrations from any text on which the attention is directed. Again, there is an intensive acquaintancy with literature, which, by the aid of the retentive memory, can, at a moment's notice, furnish the speaker with choice and appropriate material. And lastly, there is a power of voice and volubility of utterance, which enables him to speak with great ease and at the same time to give powerful effect to his sentiments. We may have heard many preachers who could reason more correctly and profoundly, who displayed more eloquent, classic elegance and polish, but we have not heard one who can more powerfully arrest the attention and carry the sympathies of an audience along with him. Though it has been extensively circulated that his prayers are irrelevant, presumptuous, and blasphemous, there was nothing in them on Sabbath last which could, with truth, be so characterized. On the contrary, they were correct, appropriate, and beautiful. He certainly has not followed the usual pulpit style, but has opened his eyes on the state of society in all its forms and phases, and adapted his professions and petitions and thanksgivings. He confesses the peculiar sins of the times, as well as the inherent and changeless depravity of man's nature, the sins of the parlor, the counting houses, public assembly, the sins of individuals, families, and nations. He offers petitions for various classes of characters, for the profligate and careless, for the old, the young, for the little children, petitions for churches, for nations, for the world, all in a somewhat novel manner. While he gives thanks for special blessings and employs language which none but the genuine believer can appropriate, and which even he must sometimes acknowledge with hesitancy. He forgets not the common benefits which all share, and the common blessings with which all are crowned. We have heard much of undue familiarity and daring pieties, but we witnessed none of them. There was an earnestness, an unction, a fluency, and an urgency, which are but too seldom imitated. His reading and exposition of the Word of God we reckon exceedingly good. Every word receives its proper emphasis and tone, and his remarks are genuinely terse, original, and instructive. On the following Thursday, my kind host, Mr. Anderson, invited about 100 friends to meet me at his mansion, that I might bid them farewell, and gave them an account of the way of the Lord who had led me into the ministry, and of the blessing he had already bestowed upon my service, and at their urgent request I promised to go and see them once a year, if possible. I told them that they had treated me far better than I deserved. Surely it was for my master's sake. I don't know how it is that people are so good to me. I have never sought the applause of men. However, if God has given me any favor in the eyes of the people, it is for me to use that favor into his glory, not to be exalted by it, but to thank him for it, and to employ it all in his service. Though it belongs to the following year, part of the letter from Reverend John Anderson of Helensburgh, which was published in the Scottish Guardian, April 18, 1856, may be appropriately inserted here. Sir, when Mr. Spurgeon was in Glasgow last summer, the fame of his eloquency had reached me in my seclusion here, by the shores of the sounding sea, the noise of whose waves delights me more than the dint of cities or the turmoil of the people. I have heard him spoken against by some, but spoken of by others as a preacher of remarkable, and since the days of Whitfield himself, of unprecedented popularity. But being one of those who judge for themselves in the matter of preaching, and whose opinions as to what constitutes good preaching are somewhat peculiar, I did not attach much, I almost say, any importance whatever to what I heard of Mr. Spurgeon and his popularity in Glasgow. One of his printed sermons, however, having fallen in my way, I had no sooner read a few paragraphs of it than I said, here at last is a preacher to my mind, one whom not only I, but whom Paul himself, I am persuaded, were he on earth, would hear, approve, and own. I forget what was the subject of the discourse, but I remember well saying to myself, I would rather have been the author of that sermon than of all the sermons or volumes of sermons published in my day. I had lately, before this, been reading Guthrie and Card, but here was something entirely different, and to my mind, and in all that constitutes a genuine and good gospel sermon, infinitely superior. For some time after this, I heard little and thought little about Mr. Spurgeon. Having been, however, in London on the last Sabbath of March, and having been unexpectedly released from an engagement to preach, I thought I could not do better than go and hear for myself the preacher of whom I had heard so much in my own country. Though from the crowd which choked the doors and passages, we did not see the preacher very well, we, and this was what we wanted, heard him distinctly. When we entered, he was expounding, as is his custom, a portion of the Scriptures. The passage expounded was Exodus 14th chapter, which contains an account of the Israelites at the Red Sea, a passage of Scripture particularly interesting to me, having stood on its shores, sailed on the very spot where the waters were so wondrously divided. The remarks of the preacher on each of the verses were very much in the style of Henry, and were rich and racy. His text was from the 106th Psalm, and the subject of his discourse was the same with that of the chapter he had just expounded, the Israelites at the Red Sea. Such was the method of one of the richest and ripest sermons as regards Christian experience I have ever heard, all the more wonderful as being the sermon of so young a man. It was a sermon far in advance of the experience of many of his hearers, and the preacher evidently felt this. But notwithstanding this, such was the simplicity of his style the richness and quaintness of his illustrations, his intense earnestness, and the absolute and admirable naturalness of his delivery. It took upon his audience generally and told powerfully. Many indeed, most of them, were of the common people, and when I looked on their plebeian faces, their hands brown with labor, and in many cases their faded attire, I could not help remembering him of whom it was said the common people heard him gladly. Yes, Mr. Spurgeon is the minister of the common people. I am told he considers himself to be such, and well he may. Happy London people, if they but knew their happiness to have such a minister. Mr. Spurgeon is equally great in the tender and the terrible, nor is he without humor. Here many will refuse him the sympathy and think him censurable. I scarcely think he is. Others will think and do think differently. His taste according to others is bad. It is, I admit, often so. But when, think of the immaturity of his years, I was told he was conceited. I saw no proofs of it. And if I had, was I on that account to think less of his sermons? I do not say I will not eat good bread because the maker of it is conceited. His conceit may be a bad thing for himself. His bread is very good for me. I am far from thinking Mr. Spurgeon perfect. In this respect, he is not like Whitefield, who from the first was as perfect as an orator as he was at the last. In respect of his power over an audience, and a London one in particular, I should say he is not inferior to Whitefield himself. Mr. Spurgeon is a Calvinist, which few of the dissenting ministers in London now are. He preaches salvation, not of man's free will, but of the Lord's good will, which few in London, it is to be feared, now do. On all these accounts, we hail the appearancy of Mr. Spurgeon with no ordinary delight, and anticipate for him a career of no ordinary usefulness. Happy are they which stand continually before him and hear his words of wisdom. As for myself, I shall long remember with delight the day on which I stood among them, and recommend such of my countrymen as may have a Lord's Day to spend in London, to spend it as I did in New Park Street Chapel in hearing Mr. Spurgeon. End of chapter 43, having been read by Peter John Parisi, also known as Brian Dean.